Studies Institute abroad and the Muslim Women's Forum for organizing and funding the conference. So I had planned my paper to be 35 minutes maximum. It could go up to 40, but we are starting at 10:20. So, let's hope everything goes according to the timing. So today I will speak about the efforts and educational philosophy of Mushir Fatima, who established a nursery at Jamia in 1955. I relate her contribution to the larger context of preschool education in early independent India and show how her intervention illustrates that the field of nursery education in the 50s and 60s in India was shaped by innovation and idealism, even in the face of scarce resources. Let me first begin with a brief sketch of Mushir Fatma's family and childhood. Mushir Fatma was born in July 1922 in the city of Lucknow in colonial India to Sayyid Muhammad Hafiz and Anis Fatma. Sayyid Muhammad Hafiz was trained as an advocate and practiced law first in Lucknow and later in Karachi, Pakistan from 1949 onwards. Anis Fatma, Mushir Fatma's mother, received her primary education from the age of 8 or 9 at Sayyid Karamat Hussain School. For some background here, Sayyid Karamat Hussain was instrumental in advocating for women's education at the Mohammedan Educational Conference in 1896. He established a girls' school in Lucknow in 1912 that later became a Muslim girls' college. Returning to Mushir Fatma's parents, Sayyid Muhammad Hafiz and Anis Fatma had 11 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. In her brief unpublished writings about her childhood and youth, Mushir Fatma's sister, Moiz Fatma, sketches her life and that of her siblings in Lucknow in the 30s and the 40s. Their home essentially was like a training center. Everyone, she says, including domestic workers, reprimanded us daily and gave us advice. Boundaries for proper conduct were laid down clearly. All children were expected to be courteous to their elders and not interfere in their affairs. Muiz Fatma also mentions how her learning was influenced by her grandfather, who encouraged them to read classical texts. In such a literary atmosphere, Muiz Fatma developed a fondness for Urdu poetry. Her other cherished preoccupation of youth was related to clothes, especially coloring and crinkling dupattas at home. She specifically mentions that Mushir Fatma was skilled at lacework, sewing, and drawing and would design lace on her own. When they were off from school during the summer, Muiz Fatma writes that they visited the village of Mindare, a few miles from Lucknow, to meet and spend time with the rest of their family. They brought gifts from Lucknow for other cousins, especially girls, such as books, silk, lace, cosmetics, perfume, and food items. Their time in Mindare was joyous, joined in company not only with cousins, but also people and children from the neighborhood. After 1947, their visits to Mindare became less frequent and died when the family moved to Pakistan in 1949. A woman who met Moiz and her sisters frequently in Mindare missed their laughter and repeatedly asked Moiz's aunt about their absence. To her query, she would simply say, "All birds flew to Pakistan." Sayyid Muhammad Hafiz and Anis Fatma, accompanied by all their children, migrated to Pakistan in 1949. Choosing to stay in India, Mushir Fatma traveled to Karachi, Pakistan with her 2 children, Afa Ahmad and Rizwana Khatun, every year during the summer to meet her parents and siblings. The departure of all her siblings had consequences for Mushir Fatma's life that are evident in the years that she spent at Jamia. The community life and sense of belonging that pervaded faculty and staff at Jamia provided much needed social support in lieu of immediate family. These communitarian sentiments of familial bonding came up frequently in my interviews with those who lived in Jamia in the 50s and 60s. Speaking about Mushir Fatma, Sadiqur Rahman Kidwai, who studied at Jamia from 1941 to 1951 and taught at JNU for many years, mentioned that their friendship with Mushir Fatma were like family relations and they would visit her home without any formality. Similarly, Ishra Jahan, whose father taught at Jamia's primary school and who's a close friend of Mushir Fatma's daughter, mentioned such visits to their home. Like her mother, Anis Fatma, Mushir Fatma received her primary education at Karamat Hussain College. Mushir Fatma's higher education illustrates her interest in teaching and early childhood learning. She obtained a bachelorette degree in teaching from Aligarh Muslim University in 1945, studying subjects like principles and history of education, along with general methods in school organization and school teaching. After completing her studies at Aligarh, Mushir Fatima attended classes taught by Italian educator Maria Montessori in India. She had attended an All India conference by Montessori in December 1945 and then attended lectures by Montessori held at Karachi from April to June 1946, earning a certificate in the method of Montessori teaching. After this certification, Mushir Fatima traveled to England in 1952 and completed a diploma in education from the University of London in 1953. I would like to reflect here on the growth of the Montessori movement that Mushir Fatima was a part of in late colonial India. The growth of the Montessori movement is an important globalizing moment in the history of early childhood education. A pioneer in child development and childhood learning, Montessori first developed what came to be called the Montessori method at 4 childcare centers that she opened in Rome in 1907 and 1908. Her observations on children and learning, particularly focusing on the needs of each child, gained popularity in succeeding years, not only in Europe and the United States, but also in Asia. She started administering training courses for teachers and developed a system of training them in her pedagogy. The publication of her book, The Montessori Method, in 1912, and its translation into 20 languages spread her educational principles in many parts of the world, including India. In the years after World War I, Montessori lectured and traveled widely. In 1929, she founded Association Montessori International to oversee Montessori schools throughout the world. Official histories of Montessori associations in India mention 1939 as a critical date for the growth of Montessori's ideas, when Maria Montessori, accompanied by her son, arrived in India to lecture and teach the first Montessori course at the invitation of George Arundel, president of the Theosophical Society in Madras, where the organization was headquartered. The outbreak of World War II left Montessori and her son stranded in the subcontinent for almost a decade until the end of the war. During these years, they trained hundreds of Indian teachers, mostly women, like Mushir Fatima, in various Indian cities. Biographies on Montessori in their sections on India have illustrated her correspondence with Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi and how they adopted principles of her approach. In the decades of the 1930s and the 1940s, Indian nationalists viewed education as a catalyst for Indian independence and nation building, and Montessori's ideas were critical to the construction of this sensibility. Recently, Erica Moretti has argued that Montessori's stay in India is significant not just for the wider dissemination of her method in South Asia, but because it highlights her role as a pacifist and a promoter of world peace. The India period of Montessori's life during the war years, she writes, enabled Montessori to rethink and expand her plan to promote peace and harmony from the classroom into a larger project of social renewal that would change the world. Other studies on Montessori in India, such as those by Meera Debs and Jana Krushnov, have highlighted the question of elitism in the Montessori education program, the nature of its adaptation in the Indian context in the 20th century, and the extent to which it was accessible to poor children. My aim in this paper is not to show the characteristic of the Montessori method, but to show how one of its trainees, or Mushir Fatima, from late colonial India, took inspiration from her and evolved her own understanding of the child and nursery education. Let me now move to the late colonial period and illustrate how Jamia leaders envisaged early childhood learning. During the decades of the 30s and the 40s, the leaders of Jamia had emphasized the role of early childhood and pre-primary learning in education. In 1946, at a speech given in Lahore, Zakir Hussain, the then Vice-Chancellor of Jamia, promoted a vision of learning and education of small children before they start their primary schools. He noted that focusing on early childhood learning was a primary duty for those interested in organization and arrangement of national life, and advocated the establishment of childcare centers for young children in the country. More importantly, he argued that if such childcare centers are opened by any non-governmental arrangement, it is the duty of the government to liberally help them. To separate small children from their homes is very new, and such a measure would be a radical step in education. Even if 2 out of 10 children of this age can be brought to these childcare centers, it is fine from the educational point of view, although statistically it is not sufficient. Furthermore, he insisted on separate teachers for these centers, saying that the government would have duly discharged its duty on the condition that a different set of educated teachers are brought for the care of this part of the school, and that there is an arrangement to keep the children in an open, airy, and clean garden in an atmosphere better than the home. For Zakir Hussain, pre-primary learning arrangements had to be the focus of any educational system. He says that poverty and ignorance often keep children of our country deprived of the true benefits of a home, and such childcare centers are necessary for this reason. But the truth is that even if the home were everything that it could be, it cannot furnish the demands of the difficulties in the young child's growth and the rapidly emerging problems that characterize their temperament. That is why in the construction of these new childcare centers, this must be kept in mind that these are both in lieu of the home and also complete the inadequacies of the home. Zakir Hussain then discusses the needs and requirements of young children that should be a priority of these childcare centers. They will have to plan for the health needs of the child and teach children good habits for life. They would need to focus on types of play that is constructive, creative, and imaginative, and provide avenues for the physical mobility of the child. He also mentioned that it was not advisable to have many children in these centers and that the ideal strength should not be more than 30 to 40 children. Zakir Hussain's suggestion that the state should play a role in establishing childcare centers deserves some attention to better contextualize the foundation of Jamia Nursery by Mushir Fatima in 1955. Efforts of Government of India after independence focused mostly on primary and secondary education for children, university and technical education at a higher level, and special efforts towards social education. Nursery education, therefore, had a somewhat lower priority in the schemes promoted by the Ministry of Education. Nurseries, for instance, hardly find any mention in a detailed report about the activities of the Ministry of Education compiled in 1948 and 1949. Yet, in the following decade, pre-primary developed into a distinct category of education in central and state documents, mostly through the efforts of private initiatives. This tendency to lean on private initiatives is indicated by the financial assistance given by the central government for nurseries. In evaluating schemes of pre-primary, basic, and elementary education in 1957, the Estimates Committee noted that, quote, pre-primary education has so far continued principally to be the responsibility of private individuals and voluntary organizations. Although the importance of this stage of education is well known, it has not been possible for the state to accept responsibility in this field to any appreciable extent, due mainly to inadequacy of funds available for education and the pressing needs of other sectors of education, as for example, elementary education, for which the state has a more direct responsibility. In its second five-year plan policy, the Ministry of Education again noted that due to severe shortage of funds, it had prioritized those voluntary organizations that were eligible for funding. The highest preference was given to the training of teachers, and the lowest preference was given to nurseries. This emphasis on voluntary organizations appears repeatedly in state debates about nursery education, and it suggests that the state viewed nurseries as part of private education instead of public institutions. Not surprisingly, governmental suggestions on the poor interest in nurseries suggested uniformity in training of nursery teachers as a solution. In its recommendation to the Ministry of Education, the Estimates Committee in 1958 noted that, quote, the committee failed to understand the absence of an all-India policy in the field of pre-primary education. The committee are of the opinion that some guiding principles, though not rigid, should be thought out in consultation with the best educationist and psychologist in the country, and they should be placed before the ministries of education in the states for guiding the various educational institutions. It is desirable that a universally reasonably uniform standard of teachers, their training, methods of teaching, and proper environment in pre-primary schools should be insisted upon, unquote. State efforts to establish nurseries, therefore, were usually not commensurate with the pressing needs of the general population. A close examination of the city of Delhi gives more insight into nursery education in early independent India. The funds allocated for pre-primary education in the second five-year plan for the city of Delhi were lower than those for expansion of basic education, secondary education, and social education. In the period of the first five-year plan, only 3 nursery schools were started by Delhi administration in the city. During the period of the second five-year plan, Delhi government proposed opening 10 nursery schools. 1 was started in 1956 and 3 nurseries were opened in 1957. The expenditure approved for the opening of 3 nurseries was rupees 41,200 in 1957, and Delhi government used only 10,863 towards this effort. In its report, it acknowledged that as compared to basic education, the actual expenditure is too low. The 3 nurseries opened in December 1957, when much of the academic year had passed. In this sparse environment in Delhi in the mid-1950s, the Nursery at Jamia was established in 1955 with Mushir Fatima as its principal. In an account of the nursery published in 1970, Mushir Fatima writes how she came to be affiliated with it and her journey with Jamia. In 1952, she says, when I was traveling to England for my diploma, Professor Muhammad Mujib said to me that I should carefully explore kindergarten and hostels in London so that Jamia can start this work, unquote. Mushir Fatima had first spoken to Muhammad Mujib about early childhood learning after she finished her Montessori lectures in 1946. She says that he posed interesting questions about Montessori and her methods. Mujib Sahab would raise objections and I would defend my beloved teacher. At that time, I did not work in Jamia, but this was my first and last interview to work in Jamia, unquote. Regarding the questions that she received during the interview, Mushir Fatima points out an interesting perception about Montessori's methods in India in the late 40s and the 50s. In those years, she says that those who worked on elementary education were raising a lot of objections to Montessori. And the wish of Montessori and her supporters was that along with elementary education, Montessori methods should be employed in pre-primary education in independent India. But Zakir Sahab did not like the rigidity of the Montessori educational method because he was a supporter of progressive education, unquote. After finishing her diploma in England, Mushir Fatima spent 2 months surveying the nurseries in London. In these 2 months, she volunteered to work for approximately 1 or 2 weeks at each nursery. This experience allowed her to become familiar with educational methods and various instruments of use at the nurseries in London. Once the plan for starting a nursery at Jamia was approved, admission started on August 15, 1955. Mushir Fatima writes that no one could have imagined that 15 years later, the school would be counted as one of the best in Delhi, and that schools in and outside Delhi would attempt to acquire its educational methods and educational instruments. The purpose of Jamia Nursery, writes Mushir Fatima, is to help in physical, intellectual, social, and emotional flourishing of the child and to prepare properly for the education of the primary school. Mushir Fatima explains in detail the principles and philosophy that was applied at Jamia Nursery, and I quote her here. Instead of the traditional method of education, there is more emphasis here on the progressive method of education. For this reason, instead of following the Montessori method and the Froebel method of education at the nursery, the method of education that was followed was based on the needs and games of children. What is the need of the child? The child has to leave the comfortable environment of the home and enter the free environment of the school, has to become independent and fulfill their needs on their own. A 3-year-old child who cannot yet run freely, who does not understand their own needs, who cannot fully speak their mind, who cannot understand others, this child has to become capable to go to school on their own, to understand the speech of others, to speak their own mind, to read and write a language, and to do calculations. One can perceive in these sentences an understanding of early childhood and pre-primary education that is compatible with some of the views that Zakir Hussain presented in his speech in 1946. What Mushir Fatima practiced in running the Jamia Nursery, therefore, was not necessarily aligned with one type of method, but was more eclectic and drawn from insights that she gained from several avenues in her life, including her instruction in the Montessori method, her training in London, her observations of the British nurseries, Zakir Hussain's understanding of early childhood, and most importantly, her own understanding of the significance of early childhood and the priorities of each child based on their requirements and welfare. What stood apart in this eclectic approach to nursery education was the importance of play. Mushir Fatima emphasized play as one of the most important for the nursery child. The growing body of the child, she says, needs play and a free space where it can run, climb, and jump. She describes various types of activities at the Jamia Nursery. The use of wooden blocks in the nursery for various types of structures was critical for motor and psychological development of the child. She also described various kinds of play using dolls. All such activity involving blocks, dolls, and physical movement encapsulated the basic principles of learning for the growing child. Such actions, writes Mushir Fatima, are not just meaningless games for children. This is how a child learns, understands their environment, controls their emotions. They learn new words in their conversations with others. They learn their specific meanings and use them in specific contexts. Finally, art and storytelling were also an important part of Jamia Nursery's life. Mushir Fatima writes that children draw in pencil, paint using brushes and their fingers, and put together different pieces of colored paper. They listen to stories, they sing songs, they enact those stories and songs wearing dupattas, coats, and caps. The play of children is their life. Oblivious of the concerns of the world, they do different kinds of play every day. Having freedom to play is the greatest blessing for them. To provide opportunity for play according to the interest is the duty of the nursery school. This age will not return, adding that we want to keep them safe from the business of counting and the burden of books. The focus on the arts, songs, and play is also emphasized by those who worked at the nursery with Mushir Fatima. On the 50th anniversary of Jamia Nursery in 2005, Jamal Fatma, who worked alongside Mushir Fatima at the nursery for many years, wrote about her experiences. Affectionately known as Mimmi Baji, she joined the nursery in 1956 and retired in 1994. She completed her training and education from NCERT 6 years later after 1956. She worked with dedication at the nursery for the next 3 decades. Jamal Fatma writes that freedom remained the central principle for engaging with children so that they could become self-reliant. They were free to express their feelings. Artistic activity involving drawing, painting, crafts, drama, and singing, she says, became central to the nursery routine. The nursery started with only 10 children, with the youngest being 2.5, although some were even younger. Jamal Fatma also gives insights into how the nursery was managed in the face of scarcity. Mushir Fatima, she says, had the responsibility of acquiring nursery equipment and sometimes contributed her own money if nursery budget was not adequate. Other schools also contacted Mushir Fatima and they requested various kinds of educational items from their own. Jamal Fatma writes that the nursery had outdoor activity such as slides, different types of swings, and cycles for physical play. Indoor educational items included beads, picture cards, building blocks, puzzles, and lacing boards. This emphasis on play is also remembered by those who attended the Jamia nursery as young children. In my interview with Tasneem Jameen, daughter of Jamal Fatma, arts and crafts was an important memory of the nursery experience. They would often do drawing not on expensive canvases, but on newspapers. Among the favorite things that she mentioned was a water hose at the nursery that was like a mini pool for children who frequently played in water. Fresh and clean clothes were set aside for this activity. There was also a sandpit where the children played. She remembered drinking a glass of milk every day at the nursery, which tasted different from the one at home. There was also an attempt to introduce children to gardening. Gardening tools were available and children used them while playing in the sandpit. Play, especially in water, is also remembered as a cherished activity by others who were at Jamia Nursery. In her account of nursery days, Simi Murtaza mentions her excitement about playing in water and how she looked forward to it. They jumped and played extensively in water and relished biscuits and milk that they were given at the nursery. In addition to the water hose, she also mentions the sandpit that had different types of plastic tools that the children used to build sand mountains and other such structures. In addition to nursery education, Mushir Fatima was also interested in children's literature. She published a small book on children's literature called Bachon ke Adab ki Khususiyat, the speciality of children's literature, that was printed from Anjuman Taraqi-e-Urdu, Aligarh in 1962. The book is part compilation of her own readings and part translation of other texts on children's literature. I have been unable to locate the exact original source in the text. The exercise of translation and compilation, however, indicates that she agreed and affirmed ideas about storytelling and children's literature found in original text and wished to communicate them to an Urdu reading audience. The book specifically points out that children's literature is determined not by the child, but by what adults decide for children. And therefore, if adults lack proper understanding of children's literature, the child will not be able to genuinely enjoy reading. The book rests on the assumption that the composition of children's literature demands attention and skills separate from other kinds of writing. It defines children's literature as an autonomous genre, arguing that children's stories can't mean that tales for grown-ups have been composed in a simple prose, but that children are a community in themselves whose experiences are totally different from those of adults. Children, the author writes, understand the conceptual difference between truth and falsehood, good and bad, happiness and sorrow, justice and injustice, but do not understand them as actions, which is important for adults. The book further defines childhood as the most important age in an individual's life, adding that the child who reads excellent literature gains a new experience in this forming and flourishing time. The author acknowledges some guidelines for what constitutes excellent literature, such as good prose, that children's literature shares with other kinds of writing. But she also takes to task a common refrain of reform found in text meant to instruct young children. According to the author, ordinary writers try to select reformist issues for children's stories. Perhaps such writers consider reform of children their duty. Many authors try to preach their thoughts in their stories. In so doing, they overlook the interest of the child. Insisting that instructional tone should be avoided in composing a story for children, the author writes that children don't want that they be told that the fox is clever, because what they want is that the fox be clever through the events of the story and through conversations, and they themselves later know the clever nature of the fox, unquote. The author writes that writing moral stories for children is a very difficult task, one that entails capabilities of imagination and the ability to write a strong prose, and that mediocre writers turn moral stories complicated and dry. Mushir Fatma's affirmation of these ideas about children's literature demonstrates a singular interest in the flourishing of the child that connects her to her interest in the nursery. The nursery was the place that would begin the journey of the child and provide the environment for their flourishing. Literature, meanwhile, was the source that cultivated their imagination, where the child knew how to read. Mushir Fatma retired from the nursery in 1980 and immigrated to Canada soon afterwards to be with her son. She passed away in 2005. I will now conclude the paper. So in conclusion, I would like to make three broad points about early childhood education based on Mushir Fatma's intervention and her life. First, the nursery remained a creative and innovative space, partly because there were few directives or mandates from the state on how nursery should be done. This provided autonomy to those like Mushir Fatma to imagine and recreate a world even with limited resources. Second, this innovation came from women, and female educators like Mushir Fatma are central to the story. Early childhood education, thus, is an important arena for women's public participation in national life. Finally, Mushir Fatma's life encapsulates what some scholars have called the transnational in the history of education. The world of Jamia's women was thus shaped by the international as much as the local and the domestic. Thank you.
Sorry. Do you want to?
I mean, whatever is convenient, I can take them now. That's fine.
I think when the paper is fresh in everybody's mind, maybe to take the questions now would be a better idea. Asiya, I'm just going to ask.
Please.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask, everybody to raise their hands so I can see it, and then we can ask questions. Jamal, are you getting up to ask a question? No, okay. So while everybody's thinking about, Nishat, you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Asiya. It was a wonderful paper. Thank you so much for focusing on the figure of the child, because every time we discuss colonial modernity or nation, concept of nation, we only focus on family, woman, and man-woman relationship. The figure of the child is always missing. So I was just wondering, because you have looked at Mushir Fatima's intervention, which was based on her understanding of the figure of child. So how does that help us or expand our understanding of, our concept of nation, or the way nation was conceived, construed at that point of time, when Mushir Fatima was working? When we insert the figure of the child, how does that mold our understanding of concept of nation and modernity, and the way modernity unfolded in India?
Okay, thank you for the question. Do you want me to answer it, or should I? Do you want?
Yes, go ahead, Asiya. Please answer.
Okay, so my attempt in this paper is, basically to show how, the field of early childhood education was actually one that was open to experimentation and innovation, and not really influenced by state directives. And that's why I bring in so much of, state archive, because, Mushir Fatma's contribution is not as a writer, but as an educator. And so I had to look at non-Urdu sources. With respect to how it contributes to the understanding of the nation, I would only say that it shows how women were, how they saw early childhood education as central to community life. And I would not say that it indicates any, there have been studies on the Montessori method, and how the Montessori method has been Indianized by various Indian educators, especially those looking at Marathi and Gujarati sources. And that argument about nationalism, I did not want to make. Because I think, that then gets into the trap of showing what is exactly the Montessori method. And when it moves from its original context, how does it become Indian? And there have been some studies that show that, the stories that they were saying that they would use in the nurseries were, for example, from ancient India and things like that. And then there are others that are actually more based on material conditions, on how it can adapt to, rural areas, and how it could adapt to poor children. So I think that, the argument about nation and nationalism is one that, for that reason, I have tried to avoid, because it takes us away from women and it takes us towards ideas of the nation that can be very static, and that can get us into debates about what is the Indianization of the method or the training that she acquired. So, the training that she acquired in London, how was it Indianized or how was it nationalized in Jamia? And the point is that her interventions, show us that she continued to experiment with early childhood education. And there have been scholars like Taylor Sherman, who recently, has argued that, in the context of Nehruvian India, that when you look at education, you see that it is actually not a centralized socialist state, because it was a socialism of scarcity. So it does not actually, it does not actually fund education as much as it depends on the innovation and experimentation of individuals in the country itself. So there is a national component, to the extent that a lot of these early visionaries in late colonial India saw early childhood education as important for nation building. But I think that if we want to focus on women, we have to sort of, that is why I have tried to avoid making an argument about, about what this means for the nation, as much as what it means for the individuality of these women.
Thanks so much, Asiya. We have another question here. And could you just briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Shada Bano from Aligarh Muslim University. Following from what was being asked and what you have already answered, this is quite interesting and also amazing, the kind of investment that the leaders, the national leaders, were giving on child education. And the kind of category of child that emerged at the time of this entire conversation, the concern over childhood and the child experience. Maybe it's a silly question, but I'm interested to know that since you were saying that it's the children were quite young, this preschool education, pre-nursery education of 2.5 and even younger, much younger than. So which were the families that were sending these children at such a young age? Because as we, maybe this is my understanding, that we see it as a very recent development of sending children to daycares, and that too at such a young age, right? So if a child of 2 years old is sent to a daycare, so what was the class of these families that were sending to the nurseries? Do we have that kind of an information, or were these elite families?
So I don't have detailed information about the class structure of these children. I do know that a lot of children who attended the Jamia nursery were sometimes affiliated with Jamia faculty or with the staff in Jamia, or they lived in the neighborhood around Jamia. And so, a lot of those, some of those that are interviewed actually were affiliated with Jamia in different ways. So, it's not, I can't. I think that the idea that it was something that was new is, was accepted. I agree that, that it was considered new even when, even in the 40s and the 50s. And in some sense, the efforts of starting a nursery was precisely that, that the home is not sufficient for for a young child, and there needs to be some preparation for the primary school, as Mushir Fatma writes. But a lot of nurseries that were actually started, there were very few nurseries that were started through state initiatives, as I try to show, because that was not well funded. So, but Jamia was one of those places that was not a private nursery. But it is also, that's not because the central government was necessarily interested in Jamia Nursery. It was because the vision of Jamia was such that it is one of the few institutions where you can get a PhD degree and you can also go to the nursery. So that was unique to Jamia itself, and and not necessarily about about the nursery. So in terms of class structure, I would say that it was mostly, I would say that they were mostly middle class, middle class families that attended Jamia Nursery, and private nurseries that that were started by private initiatives were certainly something that were preferred by by other in other parts of Delhi, that would have been preferred by more upper middle class families.
Thanks so much, Asiya. I'm going to now allow only one last question. I think, Sayeda, you wanted to ask a question? You're out of time, so you don't want to ask a question? Okay, you're going to pass. So that's, there's one question there. Yes. We'll have one question so that the others also get a chance to speak and get their share of time. So one last question for this, for Asiya.
Thank you so much. Asiya, that was a wonderful presentation. I'm Fatima from the University of Lucknow. And my question involves the comment, hi, and my question involves the comment you made that, the Montessori training was Indianized. I just wanted to know, did it also involve moving away from the Montessori method of teaching? What were the changes they brought in, etc.? Thank you.
So, about the part about the Montessori had been influential in India from right when the school was established in Rome. So the Indian newspaper started covering the Montessori schools from 1914, 1915 onwards. And it was the first school was actually established in Baroda in 1915. And then in the 1920s, in Gujarat and in Maharashtra, there were efforts by private philanthropists to actually establish nurseries along Montessori lines. And there were also journals, magazines that were started in Gujarati and Marathi. There were associations. I actually wrote down some of this while I was doing the research. There was an association known as Nutan Bal Shiksha Sangh that was started in the 1920s, whose main aim was to adapt the Montessori method to Indian circumstances. And so this had been going on, in Marathi and Gujarati languages. That is one. So Western India is one center where Montessori was adapted. And Montessori also had a lot of exchange of letters with Gandhi, and Gandhi was interested in how a method that relies on all various kinds of instruments that are not easily available in India, how that can be applied in rural areas. And then the other focus was it was also adopted in Bengal by Rabindranath Tagore around the same time, and it was also adopted in southern India. So, in Madras, and it was on their invitation that she arrived of the Theosophical Society in Madras, that she arrived in India in 1939 to give lectures. And it is in that course. So by the time she actually came to India, people were aware, those who were interested in education and the nationalist struggle, those who had the money to actually put their investments in education, were aware of the Montessori method. And after that, as I try to show that most of the trainees were, and I think most of the trainees were women, and in I have not tried to argue that Jamia Nursery was an attempt to Indianize Montessori education, because Montessori nurseries are actually, they say in their title that they are Montessori nurseries, and they are affiliated with Montessori associations. And Jamia Nursery never actually had Montessori in its name, although its main, the person who ran it was trained by Montessori. So it's very difficult to say where we place her. And there is a data set on websites of Indian Montessori Association that actually lists all the Montessori nurseries that have been established in India from 1915, and it doesn't mention Jamia Nursery because it doesn't know that Mushir Fatima was trained under Montessori. So this whole debate about what is the method that she was following, I think is one part of the story where that was one part of her influence. And then, the ideas of progressive education that were common in Jamia, what she observed in her training in London, what she learned in Aligarh. As I say, it was an eclectic approach.
Thank you so much, Asiya. Now, a brief comment by Professor Zoya Hassan about this.
Oh.
No, well, actually, I don't have a question. I just want to compliment Asiya on a lovely paper. It's really wonderful paper, and it's really nice that you didn't focus just on, through your paper on Mushir Fatima, you're really looking at educational reform and, as you said, progressive education. So I just wanted to compliment you,
Thank you so
on
much.
this wonderful paper. Thank you.
That's
Thank
a
you so
fitting
much.
end to this very wonderful paper and discussion that we had. Asiya, if you can stay with us, that'll be wonderful. But if you want to go to bed, that's fine too. And
I can stay for the panel, yes.
yes, please do stay.